Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we're finishing up the discussion of preservation of regimes, chapter 9, which is the second half. Now, at 8, he begins the argument we're going to preserve regimes, and he gives out like an account that he's going to go about the general principle and then on regimes. He's promised that we're going to be talking about preservations in general and then preservations of specific regimes. Now, the account of political change did do this. We had a general account of change in 1, 2, and 3, and 4, chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, book 5. And then we went the next three chapters, which looked at specific regimes, where 5 looked at democracies and how political change and metabole happens in democracy, what causes this, the destructions of regimes, then what causes the destructions of oligarchy in 6. In chapter 7, we dealt with the so-called regime called regime, or polity is translated by most translations, and so-called aristocracy, right? And then he ends it there, and then he gives us now, we spent last chapter looking at which we assume should be a general account first, and then we get the same thing, that we get an order where we get a general account, then a chapter for each types. But no, last chapter he kind of went, the general account also dealt with specific regime directions, both for oligarchies and democracies. He kind of kept on doing this, but now notice he doesn't talk about polity, so-called regime called regime, or the other regime, so that's interesting. But now we're going to continue 9, which is, it ends it, right? Discussion of this. Well, let's go right into 9. This is a long chapter, so as last time was a little long, this is going to be a little long also. Those who are going to rule the authoritative offices, the ruling offices, right, ought to have 3 things. So this is a general rule about those who are going to have who's ever going to be in the ruling offices. They need to have 3 things. First, affection for the established regime. So if you don't like the regime, you shouldn't let the, people who write, "I hate America and American regime is horrible and needs to be overthrown." You don't let those kind of people into the ruling offices. They have to have an affection for the regime, the established regime. Next, a very great capacity for the work involved in rule that those offices. They have to have the ability to do this. And third, virtue and justice. In other words, they have to have virtue and they have to have justice. They should be relatively. They should have virtue in terms of good character, or at least capacity to do great things, and do the right thing, and then justice. Not doing the right thing. Doing the right thing to the right people. And each regime, the sort that is relative to that regime. So for if justice is not the same in all regimes, justice must necessarily have their varieties. That's a very interesting thing. Remember, justice is relative to the regime. Justice is not here. There's perfect justice, the justice that is naturally right, what is natural justice in this general sense. But every regime itself is going to have a different. That brings us back to the book 3, chapter 10, book 3, chapter 10 of the Politics, where he dealt with each regime's claim about its justice, how its claim to rule, right? Its justice. All regimes make a claim that they are ruling justly, in this sense, and that they make a claim, right? And therefore, this is why the regime of given that we're going to talk about specific regimes, the justice that should be relevant is relevant to the justice that they should deliver is relative to the regime. Not this, and this could be dangerous. This is why we have to remember one of the reasons that cause stasis is justice, real, true justice. Why? Or real excellence, real virtue, because this is the tension between the good, what is the just simply versus what is the just in this regime. What is the law? What is the rule of this principle? What is virtue for this regime versus what is virtue simply of the human? This is the tension between the good man, who is universally good, and the good citizen. Go all the way back to that discussion in book 3 about chapters 4 about the question of the good man and good citizen, right? This whole debate, and I think this is important to understand this. Aristotle here is saying the virtue that's being discussed here about this question about what is necessary is the virtue relative, the type of virtue and the type of justice that is relative to the specific regime. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, this is that the understanding that you have to need, if you're going to have anyone in the ruling offices, they need these three categories. They need to have affection for the given regime. They need to have the great capacity to deliver the kind of work that's involved. And the third is that they again, this kind of echoes that they embody the regime in that sense. They adhere to the principle of justice and virtue that the regime holds to be dear. Okay, um, when all of these things do not occur in the same person, the question arises how one ought to make a choice. Okay, which one? 83 here. Let's do this. 83 gives us a question as a simply question arises, right? This is the question arises. The question arises, right? How do we make this choice, right? If, for example, if someone were an expert general but vicious person and not friendly to the regime, and another were just and friendly, how should one make the choice? Okay, and another just and friendly. Of course, you'd be just and friendly one, right? It would seem that one should look to two things. Which of these do all share in the greatest extent, and which to the lesser extent? In other words, which ones are things that people share more in, and what they share in other things? In other words, again, look of the qualities. Which ones do these people share in the greatest extent? And then which is the one they share least, right? The greatest and lesser. Um, in the case of generalship, then one should look to the expertise rather than the virtue, as all partake in generalship to the lesser extent. To the lesser extent, and respectability to the greater extent. So, therefore, there's an example of this: that all competence, the question is all partake in respectability, but the knowledge of being an expert general was diffused. So, therefore, maybe you should look to that like this that. But the question is, what? Okay, but if you have a general who is expert general but doesn't like the regime, that's a little too much. That's way too much choice. Again, look at the question example that one. Look at choice. Is but a vicious person who is not friendly to the regime. That's a lose lose. And another who are just and friendly. So he has to, in other words, the choice is that they're both expert general, and that's a clear choice. The classic would be the one an expert general, but not but is just, but not necessarily a friend of the regime, is better than the one who is unjust and not a friend of the regime, right? And then the one who is the better offender of the regime but unjust, depends. Um, that could be a problem too. So therefore, the question is, which is the thing that again, but the question of their knowledge of that is something the rarer thing. The expertise should be mattering, right? For a guardian of property or a treasure, however, the opposite is the case. In other words, now for specific knowledge, but here regarding money, this requires virtue. In other words, the opposite is the case. This requires virtue more than the many possess. But the knowledge is common to all. There's a little bit of financing doing this, maybe, but it's not. Maybe it's not. But the knowledge is something common to all. But the virtue, being good, being honest about this, just is difficult. One might also raise the question why. If the capacity is present as well as the affection to the regime, there is a need for virtue. Or even the two will provide, for even the two will provide what is advantageous. Or is it because it is possible for those who possess these two things to lack self control, so that just as they do not serve themselves by knowing and being friendly to themselves, there is nothing to prevent some person from being in this condition with respect to the community. Now, this is 84. The argument is that this is Lord's argument, right? The argument is that knowledge and the proper disposition do not guarantee the proper action, because men lacking in virtue will be unable to control their passions. There is a further question, however, as to whether even education to virtue can guarantee control of the passions. Now, this is the question of lack of accuracia, lack of self-control, and this is ethics, and his ethics. I think book four, book three or four. This is the line 1145A15 to 52 uh, A13, the question of accuracy, right? But let's go back here. So therefore, this is what he says here, this idea of self-control. In other words, that maybe you need off. In other words, one people argue, oh, it's not important. As long as they love that. But he then lays the question of self-control. You don't have self-control. Maybe you don't. You might not be able to deliver the good that you do. And that's the problem of accuracy, of delivering the good that you need to be able to deliver. If you might know what the good is, but you're not able to actualize it, right? That's the one who wants the good but doesn't have the ability to do the good, right? This weakness of that, and that therefore in this why the question of the expertise and the level of the regime may not be enough, right? That's the whole question here. But again, these three things and the balance of the two, which is worse, and the question of what is the rule for the generalship, it's opposite than for the question of money, where virtue plays more important than the knowledge, right? Here, simply speaking, whatever things in the laws we say are advantageous to the regime, all these preserve the regimes, as does the great principle that has often been mentioned, to keep watch to ensure that the multitude wanting the regime is superior to those not wanting the regime. So simply speaking, whatever things in the laws we say are advantageous to the regime, all these preserve. So, in other words, things whatever in the laws that are advantageous to the regime, these preserve the regime. And what else? And the other principle that's been mentioned: make sure that the multitude the multitude wanting the regime is superior to those not wanting the regime. Now, 85. This is again um, uh, uh, addressed in his discussion at. I think this is like for I think this is 49 lines 10 through 12a. I think that's 4.9. I'm not sure what this reference is. I have to look at carefully because sometimes Laura's referencing it drives me crazy because it's. I wish he would make clear that this is book one, this is book two. Sometimes he doesn't do that, and it's like the same book, so therefore he doesn't give the book. That's one of my gripes about Lord's note. That I wish he put the notes would make it clear that this is the book and not the. Make sure it's clearly the book. Okay, so we know where to find it. But again, you need to make sure the largest the part that wants the regime is the superior part, the superior part. If those who don't want the regime, those who don't want a superior, then the regime will be not stable. Okay. Besides all these things, one should not neglect what is neglected now by deviant regimes, the middling element. In other words, okay, most deviant, deviate regimes that deviate from what is just, right? They make the mistake of not caring about the middling element, the mesos, which is again this whole discussion of the mesos brings us to book 4, chapter 13. He talks about this, right, and the problem of the rich and the poor, the middling element. Okay, for many of the things that are held to be characteristically popular, overturned democracies, and many things that are held to be characteristic of the oligarchy turns overturns oligarchies. Wow! In other words, things that are sometimes things that we believe are democratic ultimately destroy democracies, and things that are we that are held to be really overly oligarchic tend to destroy oligarchies. Oh, what? In other words, if you take both democracies and oligarchies, if they go to their extreme, will undermine them, will lead to their destruction. Those who suppose this to be a single virtue pull the regime to an extreme, ignorant that just as a nose that deviates from the straightness that is most beautiful towards being hooked or snub can nevertheless still be beautiful and appealing to look at. Yet if someone tightens it further in the direction of an extreme, he will, in the first place, eliminate any moderateness in the part, and eventually will go so far as to make it not even appear to be a nose, on account of the preeminence and the deficiencies of the opposite. And in other words, the straightness and the snubness, right? This is if it becomes too much straight, or this like that. In other words, it doesn't become a nose anymore, right? And the same, it is the same with the other parts of the body as well. In other words, the idea of there's a balance of a thing. Too much an extreme of something will make it disproportionate and no longer reflect what the thing is. So this is what results in the case of regimes too. So this is not only true about the body parts, about parts of the body, but also regimes. For it is indeed possible for an oligarchy or a democracy to be in adequate condition in spite of departing from the best arrangement. In other words, you can still be adequate. It can be adequately in an adequate condition. It can be, generally it may not be the best arrangement, but it can be still adequate. Okay, but if someone tightens either of them further, he will make the regime worse, first of all, and eventually not even a regime, and it falls apart. In other words, and that's the other point. The point about this is that he makes the argument that tyranny is not a regime because why? It's not political. Tyranny is it's pure despotic rule. In other words, anything that turns the despotic rule is the rule of mastery, slavery, and it's not ruling of free people. It's not ruling of this. It's not political. In other words, that's the distinction. This despotism is not political rule. A political rule is the rule over free people, willing people. Okay, when it's ruled by mere coercion, this is only coercion, and by coercion through coercion. This is now, of course, sometimes political rule will require some coercion. Okay, there is some coercion involved because people may be willing but weak of will, right? That's all a problem, right? Or maybe some people, it is bad people who are not willing, and therefore you have to force them to be willing, right? Um, so therefore, the danger here is that if you take the regime to its extreme, it ends up not being a regime anymore, but a despot. Like the democracy taken to the last democracy becomes a tyranny. The last regime, the fourth and the last democracy is like a tyranny, as the last oligarchy, the dynastic oligarchy, becomes a tyranny as well, and that they become rule only through coercion, rule through force and violence, and become tyrannical in that character, and therefore they become not even a regime, not even a type of regime. Hence, the lawgiver and the expert in politics should not be ignorant of which of the characteristically popular things preserve democracy and which destroys it, and which of the characteristically oligarchic things preserve oligarchy and which destroy it. So, what are the things that are characteristic of an oligarchy and a characteristic democracy, and which of them which preserve and which destroy? You have to know lawgiver, an expert in politics, a politicos, and a legislator, a lawgiver and a political expert, a political scientist needs to know about what things that are characteristic popularly democratic, that are characteristic popular things preserve democracy, and which one characteristic of oligarchic things that preserve oligarchy or destroy it. The things that preserve and destroy, that unique to each category. For neither of these regimes can exist and last without the well-off or in the multitude. In other words, both need both. You cannot have a city only of the well-off, and you can't have the city only of the multitude. Okay, the city has to have both elements. It will have both elements. And when the leveling of property occurs, such a regime necessarily becomes a different one. So that in destroying the differences in property by the laws reflecting the preeminence of the people, they destroy the regime. Okay. Now this is 86. I want to talk about this now. The sentence has been variously understood. The awkward language may conceal textual corruption, right? This is one. An easy emendation towards in 310.1a would provide some important improvements that in destroying by laws those who enjoy preeminence, they destroy the regime, right? This implicit argument would seem to be that the destruction of the well-off in democracies inevitably prepares the ways for tyranny. And I think that there's an argument for that. And this is why you can read it that way as well. I think this is, Lord kind of operates with both. So therefore, this is what, in other words, that by destroying the property and that's when people are preeminent, this destroys the regime. A tyranny will arise. If you, in other words, if you in a very popular regime where the right of property is of the wealthy is to simply strip, this will lead to, it destroys the rights. It will undermine the regime. It will necessarily require great coercion and great violence to maintain it, and as such, it will lead the regime to become tyrannical in that sense, and that's why it destroys the regime. Right? Errors are made both in democracies and in oligarchies. Right? Popular leaders, demagogues, err in democracies where the multitude has authority over the laws. Right? If the multitude has authority over the laws, by always fighting with the well-off, they make the city two cities. By always fighting with the well-off, they make the city two cities. Right? Yet they should do the opposite, and always be held to be the spokesman for the well-off. So, in oligarchic rules, and this is interesting, the popular leader should not really aim at targeting the wealthy. That's the easy way. Rather, they should defend the wealthy, so that moderate the people. Now, this is when the people have authority over the laws. When the people have the authority of the laws, the error made by the demagogues or the popular leaders is to egg the people on against them. No, defend them, moderate the people. Right? This is what the smart political leader does. Why? Because it saves the regime, preserves the regime. Well, in oligarchies, the oligarchic leaders should be held to be spokesmen for the people. That they should swear oaths just the opposite of those in oligarchic swear now. In other words, for there are some cities where they swear, I shall bear ill will towards the people and take a counsel to plan whatever ill I can against them. Right? In other words, no, they should be not. In other words, he gives the example of the oaths. I will bear ill will against people. That's this kind of oath that's an the oligarch regime thing. No, that's the wrong one, because again, that's taking it to the extreme. But they ought to have and act as if they had the opposite conception, and declare in their oaths, "I will not act unjustly towards the people." So again, this is the rest. In a democratic regime, the political leaders need to what? Not egg the people on to take from the wealthy, but to defend the well-off, to moderate the instinct of this. Whereas in an oligarchic regime, you don't. The people who the regime should and those in the regime and the ruling officers should not take oaths to kind of hate the people, but rather I not act unjustly towards the people, right? That's how it ends up. But the greatest of all things that have been mentioned with a view to making regimes lasting, though it is now slighted by all, is education relative to the regimes. In other words, all regimes slight this. In other words, you need education, certain types of you need an education that is relative to the regime. Um, Certain types of education are not going to be good. It's going to be either advantageous, help preserve the regime, or attack the regime. For there is no benefit in the most beneficial, in other words, for there is no benefit in the most beneficial laws, even when these have been approved by all engaged in politics, if they're not going to be habituated and educated in the regime. And if the laws are popular in a popular spirit, if oligarchic, uh, and in an oligarchic spirit, in other words, um, it needs to be the laws have to be connected, right? He says there needs to be education needs to be reflect the kind of regime that's in question. In other words, there's no benefit of the most beneficial laws, even when they've been approved by the all engaged parties, if they're not going to be habituated and educated the regime. In other words, people aren't going to adopt it. The people aren't going to make them their second nature, right? In other words, and educated in the regime. They have to know how to. They have to know their regime, know what it is, right? They have to be habituated. They're not going to be if they're not going to be habituated and educated in the regime. People, if the laws are popular and in a popular spirit, in the oligarchic and in the oligarch spirit, if lack of self control exists in the case of an individual, it also exists in the case of a city. In other words, this is the idea of ecclesia, the idea of this lack of self control, right? This is that famous discussion in ethics. That it's also true in the city. But to be educated relative to the regime is not to do the things that that oligarchs or those who want democracy enjoy, but rather things by which the former will be able to run an oligarchy and the latter to have a regime that is run democratically. In other words, it's not to do with, in other words, this idea of educated regime is not to do with the thing what oligarchs want or Democrats enjoy, but rather the things the educating the regime means that the oligarchic regime can run well and that the democratic regime can continue and preserve itself. In other words, run again. At present, however, in oligarchies, the son of rulers live luxuriously, while those of the poor undergo exercise and labor, so that they are both more inclined and more they are both more inclined into a type subversion and more capable of it. In other words, the sons of the rich are luxurious, while the poor exercise and labor. So they are both more inclined to attempt subversion and more capable. On the other hand, those in democracies which are held to be the most particular democratic, the most radically democratic, right? What has been become established is the opposite of what is advantageous. In other words, um, the cause of this is that they define freedom badly. So the first case, the rich makes luxurious living, but then make the poor hard. In other words, the poor undergo exercises and labor. So what happens is they're corrupt, they're luxurious living, wanting, they want change, they want the things. So both are more inclined to accept subversion, and both are more capable of it, right? That's the irony, because the wealthy are just capable by their means, and the poor now, because they're hardworking and diligent, are going to be they're more capable, right? But in democracies, the problem is the opposite, right? That because why? Because they've established what is opposite of what is advantageous. Why? Because they define freedom badly. What does freedom mean? What does liberty mean? For there are two things by which democracy is held to be defined: the majorities having authority and freedom, right? Justice is held to be something equal. Equality requires that whatever the multitude resolves is authoritative, and freedom and equality involves doing whatever one wants, right? Um, 87 here. reading Quran the equality with the manuscript and rather than the phrase bracketed phrase with both the Spengel and Dresner, two German editors. So he's going to follow the manuscript and do it with the here freedom and equality, doing whatever one wants. I think there's a problem here. I think there is maybe you should bracket it off, and that's equality is up here. Do it as equality and freedom is doing whatever one wants. I think. I'm sorry. I'm going to agree with Dengiser here. Um, I think the equality refers to the other thing, and this is just why it's bracketed in that sense. Doing whatever one wants. So in democracies of this sort, everyone lives as he wants and towards whatever end he happens to crave, as Euripides says. Now, 88, I think this is, again, this is from the fragment of Euripides. They don't have to play, I don't think we have to play left. It's in the fragment text. But this is a poor thing. To live with a view to the regime should not be supposed to be slavery, but preservation. In other words, again, living to the regime means that you're a free citizen. You're not a slave. You're a free person. The regime means living in a regime means that you are being ruled politically, that you're not a slave, you're not a master. Mastery doesn't have a regime. Mastery is just it almost is this pure. It is almost the opposite of political a regime in that sense. It is without regime. It is just to be treated like a slave, masterly, right? That's the whole thing. Um, and to live what I guys want is that it is kind of like the rule behavior of a master. Right? This is why it's kind of dangerous in that sense, right? Um, such then, simply speaking, are the things that cause regimes to undergo revolution and destruction, and those that which by they and through which they are preserved and made to last. So this I think that yeah, that ends the discussion of the destructions. So he mentions that the things that destroys. So this last thing is interesting. He says regimes are going to be destroyed by what? The not educated regime. So he raises another concern here, that the question of education to the regime, and that there's going to be a difference between how oligarchies do and democracies do. And democracies, it's about making sure people understand what freedom means. Freedom here is dangerous. That if the idea that you do what everyone wants, that can be destructive to the regime in that sense, and that's what. And that can be not really, in other words, behaving like a slave. That's the danger of doing whatever one wants. You have to maybe moderate that, because you don't moderate or control that. What happens is that you become like a master. You become arrogant. You become without control. And this is why citizenship is being ruled and ruler, right? Ruler and rule. It's that as the citizen, you learn to moderate you learn to be held under authority. You learn what authority means, but then you learn how to exercise rule over others. Again, back to chapter 3 about the question of what does citizenship mean, right? The citizen. Um, Here, this is what political life is in this sense. This is why this danger of this, that freedom here is a good thing, and this is the good thing about democracy. Equality and freedom are the two aspects of it. Equality means the idea that there should be what he says, that the multitude should have authority, to be authoritative, and freedom means doing what we want, right? But a question is, what happens when doing what you want is destructive to to this to what is good, not to yourself, not only to yourself, but also to both to yourself and to the community you're in. So therefore, that's what the law needs to moderate. This is why the law comes in. The law and good habits and customs and education can moderate. This is the role of education in this sense. This is what I think he ends here, and this is why we end the book. We end the analysis here. We end the discussion about simply speaking. These then, simply speaking, are the things that cause regimes undergo revolution and change, right? Destruction and destruction, right? And what else? How they're preserved until made to last. So here we really should end the book 5. We don't. We have 3 more chapters. and and actually the next two chapters is are a digression. And the question is the question of lasting. Like the last chapter, chapter 12, one of the themes is the question of how long regimes last, the question about the lasting of regimes, and also this a question of a challenge to Plato about the cycle of regimes. But is there a cycle of regimes? And this is but then what we get next two chapters is a very interesting thing. It's a digression. It reminds one of the digression of friendship in the ethics, when in book 8 and 9 of the ethics, the Corinthian ethics, you get this discussion of friendship, right? In discussion of it's a divergent really thing. It's important. Maybe you could say it's a separate book, but here we get a little divergent thing also. We'll get divergent, and it's about monarchy. Now, I have always argued this is the next two chapters are a kind of a politics within the politics, right? Or I sometimes will call it Aristotle's Prince, because he will be talking about monarchy. Okay, so we'll stop here. If you have any questions or concerns or issues you want to talk about, or things that you want to ask me about the section, please put the comments below. Any comments as well, please put them there, and I'll respond to them when I see them. If you liked it, hit the like button. Share it with a friend. Share it on your social media. If you subscribe, of course, subscribe and encourage your friends to subscribe. It will grow the channel a little more. If you didn't like it, you can hit the down button and give you criticisms. Just be good enough to give the criticism so we can know what they are. Maybe I can learn something from it. I'm always able to learn. We're all able to learn. Another, if you want to follow me on social media, the follow links below. If you want to help contribute to aid me doing these things, you can do so. Subscribe star Patreon there. Of course, you're going to say, but you don't do anything. Okay, I understand. Yeah, but once there's a community there, I will do things. But if you want to help, please. I mean, it would be useful. Things are expensive these days, and it's going to be tough. And this does not, I'm doing this kind of like to get this done, to kind of accomplish this, to have something, like this. I should be spending a little more time on my own book. I'm writing my Aristotle's Regime, which deals with these chapters, right? Another way you can help me and help the thing, you can buy the book. This is my recent book, 2022. It's not a book. It's not a commentary like my other two books on politics. This is what I call Aristotle's. This is my notebook. It's a Cliff's Notes. It's a notebook for Aristotle's politics. It's designed as a student guide, a working book to help you go through it with outlines and breakthroughs of books and chapter analysis. Some explanations about this, the flush to the text, to kind of think about some of the questions. It's designed this is designed for a student to working with the text, to grasp it, to work with it. It's Amazon and all the major publishers, books, online services have it. You can order through that. If you order through Lulu, I get the profit. I get a little bit more profit from it, from what the bookstore makes. What the bookstore, the bookstores can make their profit. Okay, I get a little money from each, even if you buy it there. But okay, I understand why you're doing it through the bookstores online, because they ship it free to you. Lulu charges you. Well, but if I get Lulu, I get a bigger bite. So think about that. That's where you can help. Well, that's it. Next time we'll look at chapter 10, and which deals with the so-called, I call it, the discussion of monarchy, the discussion of kingship and tyranny, and why does he not talk about that separately? Okay. Well, take care, and bye.